Your desktop is currently shared with Tim.
Cool.
Does that go away, Tim, or? Oh, all right, okay. So anyway, since we completed that update to the sign ordinance, we've been slowly working away on updating the zoning ordinance. Okay, remember, we're doing this in-house, doing the best we can to try and get this wrapped up before the end of the year. Mr. Freeze is about 80% done going through making his edits, taking a lot of the material that was produced by Ansel and Glink, the consultant we used. Once he's done with that, he'll pass it along to me, and we'll begin kind of the page by page, crossing every T, dotting every I process, okay? We've also done some outreach to a few select members of the Planning Commission and the Board of Zoning Appeals, asking for them to kind of be at the ready to give us feedback. Basically, it'll just be a group of maybe like 6 people we send regular emails out to where we say, hey, we've really changed this language, or we're introducing this idea. Does this look right to you? Does this seem sensible for the community? Just so we have some folks we can touch base with as we go. These are the most senior members of the groups. Okay, so they're the folks who've seen the most cases before, so we're hoping to get some good constructive feedback from them as we go. Like I was saying, every couple of months, we'll present you with a short update just to kind of let you know where we're at. As appropriate, we might ask to do slightly longer form study sessions with you on very specific subjects or where we're making more significant changes, okay? So if there's anything in the zoning code you want to know more about, anything that I mentioned at any point over the next so many months that you'd like a little more information on, just let Randy know and we can kind of talk about how best to present that. The goal is to finally have a full draft go before the Planning Commission, which will hold a public hearing on the update in November, and then get that in front of you in December so we can finally be wrapped up with this. As a reminder, it really started in like the end of 2015, so Ansel and Glink may not have been able to get us to the finish line, but staff will. Are there any questions or concerns about this process? Again, it's all on track. We're doing well. It's just kind of the slow slog of it.
I have a few questions.
I am shocked.
Yeah. One is, I guess I could talk to Randy, or whatever, but I would like a broader discussion about
Housing types?
Housing types, ADUs, little villas, tiny homes, etc. I think we should consider that. But that's on your radar, so just for everyone's awareness, I'd like a more robust conversation other than, here's what we present or something.
Sure.
Second, sign ordinance. So there's a grace period or something to that effect.
March 1st.
Okay. March 1st.
I think the answer to the question that
Yes.
you're looking for.
Yeah.
Yes, there were about a dozen different businesses throughout the city, a few in your ward, but throughout several other people's wards as well, where there is a overabundance of signage which will no longer be allowed. They have been made aware of that and been made aware also we will begin full enforcement on March 1st. So we will be tackling that. Though I did notice there are a few signs that have popped up yet again in your ward that need to be addressed. So if you have any others in mind, please let us know.
Yeah, I guess that would be my follow-up is, as of March 1st, we know.
Yeah, March 1st is specifically for the window signage issue.
Yep.
Okay, which I know is you have a few businesses in your ward that you have made staff aware of where that's an issue.
Right.
There are some other signage issues though, which that are already in effect. They don't that grace period is only for the window signage.
Okay. So not temporary signs.
So there's
signs that
I'm
aren't
aware
really permanent.
I'm aware of signs wrapped around posts in your ward. Those are not in grace period at this time.
So understanding staff's not liabilities, but limitations.
Right.
What would be the most effective course of action to have that addressed? Just let you do your thing, or send you a list of places, or
Mr. Spaghettis came to my office at some point a number of months back with photos of signage he was concerned about and wasn't sure whether or not they were in violation or what the appropriate steps would be to address them. I would encourage any member of the council who sees signage they have questions about or think you might be in violation, take photos of it. You can send it to Randy and it'll get to me, and we will either address it or explain why we're not going to take an action on it. Chances are pretty good we already are aware of it and we're attempting to reach a resolution. But, as everyone knows, sometimes folks are a little resistant to comply with that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I assume the primary locations that I'm thinking of are certainly on your radar, so.
They are probably the
Top of the list.
Yeah, they're probably pretty near the top.
All right. Last, and not necessarily related to this, but sort of, a number of months ago, I think when it was still, even before the new older people were seated, we had, or maybe right after, anyway, we had a sustainability review or whatever that you had presented during a study session of sort of what does the city do regarding environmental sustainability, right? And that at that study session, you suggested that within a year or so, we could have more of a comprehensive analysis of what are we all doing. I assume that that project is being postponed or sidelined, or however you want to say it, for these other issues that we've been tackling this year. I mean, is a year a realistic timeline, or is that going to be put on the back burner? And if it is, that's fine. I just want to.
Yeah, so that's still something that I'm very interested in doing. In my division, I'm short 3 staff people right now.
Right.
So I'm having a bit of a hard time getting to that as quickly as I was hoping I was going to be able to.
That's fine. I understand.
But it's still on my radar. I'll keep you posted. There's a lot of other things that I'm trying to get done. Cannabis being one of those.
Yeah.
In the course of updating the zoning code, sustainability will continue to be something that's a part of that discussion. So it'll still keep coming up.
Yeah.
Something that I need to get finished sometime in the near future, and this is something Randy, Public Works and Parks and I have all discussed, is a emerald ash borer management strategy. We have a lot of ash trees. A lot of them are fested with EAB. They are city trees. We need to have a strategy in place for slowly phasing the ash tree out,
Right.
because that's actually something that poses a potential risk as limbs begin to drop. So that's also something I need to tackle first before I move on to some of those more general sustainability questions.
That's
So
fine.
it's still on the list, but it's been bumped down a little bit.
I appreciate everything that you do.
Okay, Ivory's on the phone, Ivory Clark. You got any questions on this issue?
No, I don't.
Okay,
I'm going to be doing a lot of listening to try to catch up, guys, so just bear with me.
no, that's fine. We just want to make sure you have a fair shot at saying something.
All right, thank you, Mayor.
All right. Cannabis, please.
Okay. Oh, all right. So there are some things we need to talk about in regards to our cannabis ordinance and some changes that have been made at the state level, which we need to consider incorporating into our ordinance. So you will recall that when we first began talking about the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, one of the things that I said was that we should anticipate that it will be amended many, many times over, okay? It's a little over 500 pages. There's a lot of content. In early December 2019, the state legislature met for a veto session. A lot of us who are keeping an eye on them in this kind of subject area were expecting them to make some changes, but we didn't anticipate very many, okay? What ended up happening is that there were edits made on at least 400 of those 522 pages, okay? So quite a lot of things. Most of them were pretty minor clerical changes, just cleaning up some language. weird typos. You can imagine how many things get slipped into a bill that large, okay? But there was one significant change that we need to talk about and come to a consensus on. And it addressed the issue of cannabis consumption in private spaces other than those which are state licensed, like dispensaries, okay? Shortly after the act was adopted in its original form, a lot of communities noticed that there was language in it that seemed to make it possible for people to set up spaces where people could take cannabis they had legally consumed elsewhere and bring it to that site and then consume it there. That wasn't like their home or a licensed cannabis business. So a lot of people got very worried about this scenario. There's the vacant storefront downtown. Some kids buy it, okay? Then they charge like a $5 entrance fee for their members-only lounge. And suddenly there's cannabis being consumed, on every block face, and there's no rules, okay? These concerns eventually made their way up to the state legislature, who have attempted to address it, okay? Now, these spaces are given a whole lot of different names: clubs, lounges, cafes, you name it, someone's come up with a word to describe it, okay? The changes that were adopted at the state level do not include any of these words, okay? So there's no state definition for a cannabis club or a cannabis lounge or a cannabis cafe. You're not going to find those words in there, okay? Generally, though, when people use those terms, they're describing a space kind of like this, where there's no on-site sale of cannabis, okay, or cannabis products. You charge a member's fee or an admissions fee. In so doing, you render it a private space, right? Anyone can go into a restaurant or a coffee house, right? They're public spaces. A country club is a private space. Not anyone can go in there. Same sort of concept. Patrons would, of course, be bringing cannabis that they had gotten from a legal dispensary or other place to there to consume it on site. And it could theoretically operate anywhere, okay, because it wasn't really addressed by anyone's zoning code or anyone's municipal code more broadly. This is an example of and I'm going to show you a few images just so you can get a sense of what some people are thinking about, if this is like a business model they're pursuing. This is a comedy club up in Toronto, different country, different province, different rules, but basically the idea is that they're not selling any cannabis there. It's a comedy club, but it's a private members-only space, right? So you can bring your cannabis that you bought at the dispensary down the street there and see a show, right? So here in Illinois, this is how the state legislature chose to address this question, okay? They decided to narrow it down to a certain type of business that could also be a cannabis lounge or cafe or club. All right, they narrowed it down to retail tobacco stores that qualify for an exemption from the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, okay? And that exemption allows them to have indoor smoking already, all right? The changes they made also explicitly allowed cities to allow or disallow these and to regulate them as they saw fit. Okay, so previously it wasn't even clear if a city could take an action in regards to this. There was this big pause. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the state to decide on the route that it was going to take, okay? If a city chooses to allow these things, okay, these lounges, cafes, clubs, still are subject to all the other provisions of the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, okay, including a prohibition on selling food and alcohol, okay? This is the definition of a retail tobacco store in state law. Remember that the lounge, the club, the cafe, those words are not defined. This is defined, and there's a few little parts that I want to highlight. Okay. In order to be a retail tobacco store, 80% of your annual gross revenue has to be derived from tobacco or tobacco-related products, okay? Pretty broad. It also must maintain a designated area for the smoking to take place. It could be one small part of the store. It could be the whole store, okay? Just has to maintain a clearly defined space. And again, these spaces, these types of businesses, they can't have any liquor, food, or restaurant license, okay? So it's just the tobacco that's at the forefront of this. So here's kind of what we, oh, and one other thing. Mo Greens in San Francisco, beautiful. I would encourage you all to look them up and look at the prices they charge. Be worth your time to see sort of what the membership fee really looks like in places like that. So if you are interested in allowing these here in Rock Island, basically what's being proposed by staff is that you insert that state definition of a retail tobacco store into our cannabis ordinance and adopt a few very simple, straightforward rules, okay? The first would be that we would allow them in any industrial district or any business zoning district with the exception of B1. That would mirror the rules we have in place in the ordinance already for a on-site consumption dispensary, okay? They would need to comply with the 100-foot from any residential zoning district rule that's already in place in the rest of the ordinance. And that it must have a secured area limited to people ages 21 and up. Again, you have to be 21 to smoke here in Illinois, so it's just reinforcing that, okay? And emphasizing that the space, needs to actually check people's IDs. The decision to allow this is yours. Staff is not making a recommendation one way or the other. If you want to go forward with it, though, we do strongly recommend a more simplified approach, okay? Keep it straightforward, keep it understandable. Like the rest of the ordinance, we just refer outward to state law. We don't try to make up any rules for fear that they may ultimately come into conflict with the other 522 pages. Also, because we know that they're probably going to continue to amend it and tweak it over the next few years, it's probably better that we try not to insert too much detail, and we instead say whatever it says today, those are the rules. We're also, if you're looking at adopting something like this, going in this direction, at this time, we are not suggesting that we adopt any special fees or permits for these, that we instead just let the zoning rules apply as they are, in the same way that we are allowing all the other cannabis, licensed cannabis businesses to operate. But if you were interested in doing that, there's nothing in the law that says we couldn't impose that sort of fee or permitting structure. Okay. Now, I'm sure there are some questions about this.
Yes.
Who wants to start? Go for it, Mr. Hurd.
So I've got some concerns over owner liability as far as patrons go that would be leaving these cafes or lounges. I've been doing a little bit of research on this, and I guess I would direct this question more towards our city attorney. How do dram shop laws apply? I mean, I know we're not like a dispensary and selling it there, but I mean, there's obviously some serious questions if somebody were to leave those areas, and there's what is the liability that the business would hold, and what is this? Is there any city liability that would also accompany that?
Well, I can't specifically say, because I haven't looked up the dram shop equivalent. I'm sure that the insurance companies are looking to, I would imagine they're going to be looking into making some money and making a policy that will fit that model. What it is, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm guessing that, and certainly the city could require it, just like we do with other contracts or other agreements where we say you have to have a policy that covers $1 million, covers the city up to that as well, even though it may not be required. I assume the state's going to come up with some sort of dram shop-like insurance, even though you're not selling it there. I'm sure there's going to be some obligation to make sure that your people aren't leaving not knowing what, not capable of being safe or conducting themselves or with ordinary care.
Thank you, Dave.
Sure.
Also been reading up a little bit about dispensary agents that would be, I guess one of my other concerns is people leaving there. How is it being monitored? How do we know how much they're smoking? How do we know that they're bringing it in that's from a legalized dispensary and they're not just bringing stuff off the, out of off the street? Or what if they've been somewhere else, smoked a bunch there, went there, and then leave? I just think there's a lot of liability. Again, this may not be a question, but I guess I'm just gonna give you my opinion on this. I think that there's, I don't think the city or maybe even the state has quite clarified how this is gonna be enforced by local law enforcement. My own opinion is, I think there's just too much out there that's unknown at this point. So, just gonna offer my opinion on that.
James, you want to?
This is kind of a spontaneous question, just occurred to me as you were talking about the whole issue. I believe in the past, and maybe it continues in the current time, that the police department they make what I call bar checks, to just be sure that everything's okay, that there's no minors inside, and maybe other things that they're looking for. One question that I have, probably, maybe not for you, maybe for the police department, but it's be a concern as to whether the police would be required or in some way inspecting or doing any checks on the licensed cannabis lounge.
So, and I invite the chief to come up if he has any comment on this. For the actual state licensed cannabis businesses, and what I was just describing would not be one of those, okay? The state police are responsible for the enforcement of law for those. For these, I don't know. I'm not sure the state has the answers to some of these questions that are coming up.
I think the chief's on his way up.
Yeah, so I would invite the chief to offer comment on that.
Because they're not licensed facilities.
Right, and that's.
We can if we wish.
And that's important to understand, that
They're not-
don't fall in that category.
We could require that, but
I guess I don't have a specific answer either. The police department has gotten very little guidance or training from the state of Illinois when it comes to cannabis, the new laws and enforcement. As a matter of fact, state training that's provided by mobile team units is in jeopardy. There's significant funding cuts. So I don't expect that there's gonna be a whole lot that is available for us, and we're literally in a lot of uncharted territory.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
I guess we'll just work our way around the horn if you don't mind. We'll just keep. You
And
have
I
something?
would think that, just like with the insurance issue, if you were to make it a local license, I would think that you could say that it's subject to these, subject to checks by police and so forth, if that was a direction that the council wanted to go. I don't believe there would be a problem with that.
I guess I'll add, like I said, we'll
have
just work
one
around the horn.
question.
It doesn't, is that I have some of the same concerns that Alderman Hurt has is, how do you know, and once again, and I'm not asking, the question may be just more of a statement, is how do you know if they're bringing in legal cannabis or stuff that they bought illegally? My understanding is they can only transport it if it's still in the original container that's odorless. And so if they bring that in there and don't consume it all, now they leave, technically they're in violation because it's not sealed anymore. So that's like alcohol, it's in a unsealed container. And so they would be, if they were to be stopped, they could be fined if it's under the right amount of product versus arrested. So that becomes an issue, is that are we encouraging and looking for how people are transporting this stuff from either already open before they even get there or when they're leaving? And so that slippery slope to how to be monitored. I don't know, the question is, on these separate rooms, are they separate areas or separate rooms? Do they have to be a door closed and everything else? So if I want to go in there to smoke a cigar, I'm not exposed to cannabis.
So because I think you all actually got a copy of the draft ordinance. So if you go to there, you will see that one of the things that staff is supporting right now, unless you want something different, is that there would be a designated secure area within the business that separated the cannabis from anything else,
So
okay?
secured, so your assumption, your understanding of a secured area is with a wall and a door and,
That is what the proposed local rule would be. In the act as it's written,
Right.
it could either be a part of the business or it could be the whole thing. It depends how you want to set it up.
okay. So locally, we could set it up as a separate room, so if I wanted to be, don't want to be exposed to cannabis, I could still go in there and smoke a cigar, or whatever. Okay, and not have the exposure to it. The other is, now, I assume it's still, if I remember the smoking law, the state smoking, it has to be in a standalone building?
If you were starting it from scratch, if
Right.
you're opening a brand-new, retail tobacco store, yes, it needs to be a standalone building.
Is vaping considered tobacco products?
So that's a good question. Vaping does in some cases fall into a bit of a gray area. So like right now in our local tobacco ordinance, we don't address vaping at all, right? We don't really address this kind of this is something eventually I'd like to address, for us to address as well. We don't address like nicotine products. We address tobacco in a very traditional sense. That no longer really clearly defines what the status of vaping is, okay? That's in our local ordinance. I mean, I guess, to be honest with you, I mean, there are people smoking cannabis out and about right now.
Sure.
There have been for a very long time.
Always.
You don't always notice. There are people vaping around us, all the time, who may well have, a THC-laden product, and we wouldn't maybe notice, These questions of enforcement and how do we know where it came from and who's checking, and if they leave with a, not appropriately packaged product, like who's going to know, who's going to check, what would the consequence of it? I mean, I invite Mr. Morrison to comment on this, but it's the state's job to figure the answers to those questions out. And the state hasn't figured them out. As far
Correct,
as,
but my
so,
understanding is-
so,
Go ahead.
the uncertainty around this, I mean, it's about you as the council deciding how much of that you're willing to take on, right? I think that's why the act basically at this point says you have the choice and you have kind of carte blanche to figure out what rules you want, okay? So, I mean, I don't necessarily have all the answers to this either, because it's, in a sense, not to abdicate responsibility, but it's the state's responsibility ultimately to answer a lot of those gray area questions.
Correct. But my understanding, the last time I believe, and Chief can correct if this is not right, but is that they are still going to enforce if they stop somebody for just cause, whether it be they smell it, whether it be a tail light out, whatever it is, and suspect cannabis being in there, that is not, that they can search and find out if it's legal or not,
That's
and then
correct.
ticket.
That's correct, and
people.
I don't know if the chief wants to chime in here, but
No, he's agreeing with that.
yeah, if you get pulled over for a tail light,
Yes.
and you roll down the window and the cop can smell cannabis in the vehicle and has any reasonable sense that you may be under the influence while operating that vehicle, they can still pursue a search of your vehicle, and they may also arrest you. So that is true. Mr. Morrison, I saw you wanted to kind of chime in.
Yeah, sure, it would, and that was my point, I guess, is that although the state will make the rules, actually, almost all of our statutes are set by the state, all of our statutes are, and then our ordinances are local, but it will fall to the chief and his employees to enforce the state law when you run into that on the street. So I just wanted to make,
It's
that
not the
point.
state police or anything else that are doing it, it's the local police that
Correct,
would be
yeah.
doing that, enforcing it, the state ordinances or laws along with the city ordinances. And so those would be still illegal, whether they be ticketed or arrested, depending on the severity of the issue, the volume they have, under the influence or not. That's all subject to our ordinances. I guess just in a general concern, I guess I have in doing this, is that my concern also is the slippery slope, I guess I would call it, is if you, and I relate it to the gaming, if we all remember, the casino boats were $200 lost total, and the boats had to cruise. Now look where the law is, and it didn't take too long to get there. And so even though these laws are somewhat restrictive, vague in some areas, but restrictive more than you see maybe in Colorado or California or whatever, my, I guess, concern, speculation, is that we end up going down that slippery slope of all of a sudden the state then changes them again, and it gets looser and looser. And even though we can change our ordinances adapting some of those things, you typically then are putting businesses that maybe created themselves in between there at harm of either changing the rules on them or grandfathering them in. And so it makes it difficult to then claw back, if you want to guess, so to speak. And so that's a concern I have, is right now, there wouldn't be a whole lot of them. But I have a concern that that could change in the future, because this is very common in a lot of laws, that they get them passed. To get them passed, they try to meet everybody's demands, and then once they're in there, it's easy to change them as the goes, especially for the financial need of the state or the city or whatever it is. And that's I guess another comment that I have is that at this point, there's really no financial gain by the city to do this, unless we license it and charge for that license or special use permit, if we choose to go down that road. It does help the business potentially in trying to stay alive, or because they're stimulating more business. If they're selling more, people are coming in there, they might sell cigars or cigarettes or whatever products, because the people are traveling through there. So there's that byproduct, that potential's there.
Yeah, I mean, and
Other than that, there's no revenue.
well, I mean, it depends a little bit. So I included some of these just so you can kind of see the ways in which these, because I want to make sure that because this is an important policy question. You know, once you make a decision, if you want this, staff will work with you to get to a place where we can make some sort of framework work, if you want it. Like this, a comedy club. That was the extra thing that they had, so that there's some revenue there. And who knows, maybe that has secondary and tertiary benefits for the local economy. This is a like arcade bar vape club, okay? So again, there's a potential other way of making income. It takes so many different forms. There are so many different ways in which you might add a little revenue here, add a little revenue there. That's not really about the cannabis itself. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say. You brought up a very good point, Mr. Mayor, which was that in different states they have different laws, and these things are taking very many different shapes.
Yes.
Here in Illinois, we don't yet know exactly how it would look as different people try it out. Okay, so it's hard to come up with really good examples of exactly what we might see if it were allowed here. I've tried to pull from a few different places, you know, to sort of illustrate that, but you know, at the end of the day, this is a policy decision that you as the council need to make a decision on. If you want to move forward with it, staff will try to figure out a way to make it work so that we can, as good as we possibly can, address the concerns that you're bringing up.
One other, I guess, comment about that, and then I'll continue to pass it on, is once again, yes, staff will be and everything else, but staff's time, it takes time to do that, and is the return for the benefit for them to do that there. You want to keep it simple, to try to keep your time limited.
Yes, and the full transparency, some of the reluctance to include a permitting or licensing process in this is because staff will need to then review all of those and figure out, we'll need to come up with whose time is going to be spent to do that. And depending on how complex you want to make the rules, that review process might take longer. That's putting aside any questions of if people need to pursue a special use permit to do it where they want to do it.
Right. So the payback might not be there right now. And that's why, I guess, one last statement, and it's more of a statement, is that, and that's why I guess not that I vote unless it's a tie, but I do oppose this sort of thing at this point, and would appreciate more of the wait and see as time goes to see how laws change, wait and see whether it's 6 months, a year, who knows? I'm not putting a time limit on myself, but let's wait and see what shakes out in other cities and parts of the state, in successes or whatever. I'm not sure we want to be the leading edge, my personal opinion, the leading edge on this at this point. If somebody else wants to, let them, and we'll learn from them, is my opinion. So,
Mr. Mayor, I would like to, I agree with you on this. I think there's just too many unknowns as far as enforcement, liabilities, those kind of things. And again, I don't think we should be the leading community.
Mr. Spaghetti, I'll get to you in a second. Let's get everybody a chance here real quick to.
I'm just going to quickly say that if at some point the council decides they want to move forward and have staff pursue this, I would be in favor of licensing it and restricting the number of licenses so that there was few, would be few of these places. And that would also be a benefit to staff because you wouldn't have to be reviewing lots of applications if they only had one or two licenses that were filled. They're filled. And thirdly, why not, along with licensing it, charge a fee to help defer for staff's time or whatever? And I'm not suggesting what level the fee is at this point. That's getting ahead of the,
Again, at this point, we don't have anyone to look at to determine what an appropriate price would be for that.
I'll come up with a number.
Alderman Parker.
Thanks, Mayor. I think the broader philosophical or policy point that I would like to make is just general. I think a lot of the same discussion that we're having up here is the same discussion that the state had about prohibition at large, right? That when the state was debating whether we want to legalize recreational cannabis, we had all of these very same discussions about, well, how do we make sure that people aren't going to be stoned while driving? How are we going to make sure that they're going to be able to do it without it being part of the black market? How are we going to, all of the concerns, and they're legitimate and they're fair. I mean, we don't want people getting totally blazed out of their mind and then getting into their car and driving home and hitting somebody, right? Obviously. The general point, however, though, I think, is that we, for a very, very long time in this country, in this city, we've allowed people to go to bars and get, I don't want to say as intoxicated as they want, right? Because there are rules about that, dram insurance, things like that. But on the principle of the matter, we have generally accepted and understood the role in which public places for people to enjoy in libations provide a community, right? It's the local watering hole where you get to go down there after work and have some beer with your friends. It's the whole reason that Cheers was a TV show, right? And so on the principle or the philosophy of it all, I think that there are just as many merits in allowing a cannabis lounge or club or whatever we want to call it as there are for allowing the neighborhood tavern. However, I do recognize the very real concerns that a number of my colleagues up here have raised, and I think that's where staff were very intelligent in how they approached this, because the matters of, well, how do we regulate all of this stuff is, as Miles has explained, is up to the state. We did not vote on legalizing recreational cannabis in Illinois, right? And it's our opportunity and our responsibility to react accordingly to state legislation. I think that we really do have a unique opportunity to be, while I understand the concerns about being the leader on this, I also want to recognize the opportunities that being the leader on this provide as well. There's a balance, and you don't want to become known for being the bar alley where it's nothing but drunks walking around, but at the same time, trust me, people my age, there is a huge interest in being able to go to a club, watch a comedy show, smoke a joint, and go home. Just like when I went to Circa 21 Speakeasy this past weekend, I saw a show, I had a responsible amount of alcohol consumed, I enjoyed it, and I went home, right? And so it's the same idea. And so I would encourage us to keep an open mind about this. I think it has a lot of opportunity. We already have a local business person interested in doing this, right? So let's be innovative. Let's be welcoming. Let's work with the private sector. Let's work with police. Let's work with everybody. But I think we have the real opportunity to do something unique for Rock Island. We're going to have Iowans coming to downtown, or wherever this is going to be, but we're going to have Iowans, we're going to have Moliners, we're going to have Coal Valley people, whomever, coming to this location to enjoy a legal substance. And it does have ancillary benefits, right? Whether it be buying a soda or leaving there and saying, hey, what's this art gallery over here? Let's go check that out, or whatever the case may be. I think it's just part of the amenities that we can offer for the city of Rock Island to residents and visitors that make this a cool place to be. So I would like to, well, one question. So basically, if the way in which you've proposed this, if we pass this, as long as a business complies with the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, or whatever the name of the state legislation is, then they can allow on-site cannabis consumption. Correct?
Assuming they meet those other like 3 conditions, okay? So the business in downtown, which has expressed the interest in doing this, would meet those conditions.
Right. So,
I would also point out that they are not the only one.
yes.
And there's varying degrees of meeting those conditions that each one of those interested parties meets.
They're meeting the conditions as far as the city's concerned. There may be others that are not. That building happens to get federal funding, so whether that passes the acid test, that's maybe not for us to regulate.
Yes.
But for the state to regulate, so I
Yeah,
understand
I
that.
would-
But they may not pass the acid test there.
And relative to the city's interest.
Yes.
That's
Okay.
not, I don't want to regulate that, I don't want to, whatever. Let's just
I
make this
understand.
as
That's
easy
why
as
I
possible.
clarified,
A question that I have is there, I guess this is the question for like a special use permit or something like that, but we want to make sure that these businesses do comply with the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, right? That somebody's not just like, yeah, I got a license from the state to sell tobacco, and I can do this here, right? Like, we should at least verify that they have the proper permitting or licenses from the state to be a tobacco retail shop, I would assume.
Yeah, and we can do that.
Okay. That's the only question that I really had. I would encourage us to be open-minded and forward-thinking about this. It's not like this is going away, right? It's only going to become more prevalent, and we have the opportunity to welcome the innovative private sector to do it here, and I think that's a cool opportunity. I would like to make note that Ivory has not been given the opportunity to weigh in on this. That's correct. We're going around the circle.
You're right, I
so,
apologize.
no problem. It's easy to forget that he's available.
Okay. Hey, should I wait or just can I speak now?
You're going to speak, Ivory?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Can we turn Ivory up a little bit? It's hard to hear him.
Tim's working on it if he can. All right, try it now, Ivory.
Okay, can you hear me now?
A little better.
A little better. Speak up.
I'm speaking as loud in the speaker as I can, so
Okay.
hopefully you guys can hear me. Regardless of how we feel about marijuana, I feel that we can get thrown off by our feelings there and not look what's best for Rock Island and look what's best for people that want to actually participate in business in Rock Island. So I have to agree with Dylan when he says there's opportunity here for us to be the leaders and also benefit other businesses in Rock Island, because this is the direction that it's going. That people are if we want to attract young people, they are doing these things, and therefore I don't see how we can just say we disagree with this, we want to wait, when the law is recreational marijuana is legal now. So therefore I think we have to say, how do we benefit as a city? And Alderman Spaghettis was talking about a fee. I don't know if that's something we do. I don't know if we look at what the tobacco, like the cigar store, the cigar lounge in downtown. I don't think they pay a fee. Do they pay a fee, Josh?
Do they?
Do they pay a fee?
Do you pay a local
There's a
fee
tobacco license,
for the city?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the only fee that's what they pay?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so if we looked in that manner and said what we can do with that, in that process, I would understand if we did that. But overall, I want to say this is something we can be forward-looking on, forward-thinking, and just actually welcoming instead of putting up our walls again. And based off of how we feel about marijuana, I just hope that we look at it a little differently and say, it's legal now, how do we benefit as a city? And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. say on that issue.
Okay, thank you. Alderman Poulos.
Thank you. Well, and my colleagues have made some very good points tonight. I'm not going to beat it up again. I will say that with all due respect, I don't think we should rush into this. I think we need to consider all the ramifications of moving too quickly in this area. I also think that we should not only invite but encourage the police department to offer some of their guidance, some of their experiences, so that we don't put them in a situation that is untenable. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but again, I think that we should not rush into it until we have more answers than what we have right now.
What additional answers would you like?
The additional answers I would like would unfortunately come from experience of other areas that have these smoking lounges. What is their crime rate around the smoking lounges? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Clearly, if it's gone down or stayed the same, then that's a non-issue. If it's gone up, then maybe that's something that we should look at.
Yeah, so there aren't any of these right now in the state. There's one that either is getting ready to open or just opened that is associated with a dispensary, so that's a state license establishment. That's the first one in the state, and it's in Springfield, I think. So there really is no information on that now. I mean, it would take, a month, a year. I don't know how long you would want to give it. I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. What information do we want to gather if you want some more
You
information?
could look outside the state, though. You could look at Colorado, for example.
So kind of like I'd mentioned earlier, Mr. Spaghettis, every state has approached this in a different fashion. So it's a little bit difficult and perhaps unfair to draw too many of those comparisons. So I'm not entirely sure how helpful some of that information might be to the questions we face with Illinois law.
Well, we have zero information now.
Well, that's kind of the problem,
Yeah.
right? Is that we don't have information about how it will play out here in this state because it has not yet played
You
out.
get skewed information if you go to Colorado or California, whatever. That information, you get more information, but it may not be relevant to the issue.
Right, but you
because
guys
there's some
just,
difference.
so it was just mentioned, the information is not out there yet, so this is why this needs to be held off for a bit until further information gets out there. I mean, you ask what further information, well, we'd like to know what the liabilities are. Is there a dram shop insurance? How do we regulate what they're bringing in and what they're leaving with open containers? What's the city's liability? There's a lot of questions out there regarding the enforcement of this, and I think that until we know what those answers are, I think we're just kind of like jumping into this without having all the information.
Chief, are you wanting to weigh in? Go ahead, Ivory, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But that is what staff can do. They can bring us back if we have the questions. I don't really hear the solid. Well, I mean, we can give the staff a list of questions that we have and have them look into it the best that they can, and then come back to us, and then we can make a decision to move forward or not to move forward. But if we don't give the questions, I don't know, because I'm not understanding. I just thought it was simple if we just said, well, it's not simple. That's unfair. It's not simple. But I thought it made sense if we looked at what the tobacco laws were and the use of tobacco inside and all those things. Since it is legal as marijuana is legal. So maybe if we just give staff the questions that we have, we can come with a reasonable way to move forward, or just say, no, we don't want to move forward.
Mr. Mayor, this might be a point where those who have a vested interest in this, who are thinking about opening up a cannabis cafe or a lounge, if you will, to sit down with the police chief or a committee that he designs or he appoints to look into this further, so they can have a dialogue as to how to proceed or not proceed with that. And I see the chief shaking his head. It clearly is, I think the smart thing to do is to involve all parties, let everybody sit at the table, and then bring back that information to council so that we have a more informed view, as Ivory Clark had mentioned.
Chief, is there anything you wish to speak about now about it, one way or the other, or you want to think about it, or, I don't want to put you on the spot, so if,
Understanding that this is a council policy decision, I would agree with Alderman Poulos, Alderman Hurt, to take a more slow and cautious approach to this. I see no reason why we have to rush headfirst into this. You know, obviously things will change with time. I would just, I guess, advise to proceed with some caution and due diligence and make decisions based off of what we find out. So, and whatever direction council wants to give for the police department's involvement, we'll be happy to facilitate that.
okay?
A few other questions. Thank you, Chief. Or questions, comments. In the cannabis ordinance that we already passed, the zoning, or whatever, the comprehensive one, do we spell out that public consumption of cannabis is prohibited? Or do we just refer to the state law that says you can't smoke cannabis on the sidewalk?
So remember, it's designed to be simple and just refer right back out. It refers right back out because we suspect the act will continue to be tweaked.
Right.
So, as of right now, the state act has been amended in such a fashion where it clearly identifies where you can consume and where you cannot.
Right.
In a way, in its original form, it was less clear.
What I'm getting at here is, do we have a city ordinance that bars taking a beer from inside a bar and walking outside? Now, we have city ordinances that say you can't bring glass bottles out onto the sidewalk, if I'm not mistaken, something to that effect. But do we have any ordinance that explicitly says that you cannot leave a bar with a half-drunk beer in your pocket?
Yes,
City ordinance.
yes.
So then could we not create city ordinance that says you can't leave a cannabis lounge with a half-smoked roach in your pocket? I mean, I'm trying to replicate and say, okay, I mean, we have the policy, we have the tools already in place for doing this with bars, right? You can't take a glass bottle out onto the sidewalk. Well, you can't take a half-smoked roach out onto the sidewalk, and we would enforce it with the police in the same way that we enforce you can't take a half-glass bottle at a bar outside, right? The bartender sees you going outside and says, hey, you can't do that, and if you say, I'm doing it anyway, then they call the cops. If the lounge owner or worker sees you walking out of the lounge with the joint in your hand, you know, stumbling outside, they can say, hey, you can't go out or whatever. The point is, I think that we have the tools to make sure that this is done safely, and I think, generally speaking, I know our opinions are varied on this, but I think generally speaking, what we're all getting at is we want this to be safe and regulated, and, you know, that's generally the consensus that I'm getting. Now, whether we think that we're there or not may be differing, but if we can do this safely and, you know, appropriately, fairly, whatever word you want to use, then I think we can. And so perhaps the questions that Randy's asking for is, okay, our concern is that people are going to go walk out on the sidewalk after consuming too much. What do we do for bars equivalent, and how can we guarantee that, you know, or have mirroring legislation to kind of address that at the cannabis side? Does that make sense? What is it, I mean, what do people think on that?
Would it not make as much sense to give the police and the vested or interested parties, give them time to have some dialogue and to try to figure these things out, rather than those of us who are at the table here who don't have that experience?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And then let the police department let the police department or someone, another interested party, come back to council with some recommendations.
And we have, I know city staff have been meeting with the interested party to talk about, okay, what is your business plan here? How is this going to work from the private sector side of things? I don't know if you want to talk on that at all, but we, being the city and city staff, have already for months been in dialogue with the private sector interests to say, okay, what are your thoughts? What are your plans? Is that not correct?
You know, that was specifically just a business plan. I don't know how detailed that is. These issues we're talking about here today haven't been discussed to my knowledge, have they?
They have been discussed. So we have talked about it. So part of the delay, right, was that we suspected that the state was going to make a change. We weren't sure when, and we weren't sure what it was going to look like. All right. So when we were passing the cannabis ordinance the first time round, all right, we passed it knowing what we knew then. Okay. There was then interest in people pursuing this lounge cafe model. But we were not sure at that time what the law would ultimately say about them. It didn't fit in anywhere. We waited and we waited. The state finally took an action, okay? Since it's taken an action, we have had some dialogue about, with business folks about what these really look like. What is the idea, the concept, the setup? What would they control? What would they not control? What would be the thing that they would do? So we have had that dialogue. We have another meeting with another interested party on Wednesday to talk about it. So, I mean, we, are having those chats. But again, I mean, it's variable what people might want to do. There's not one way to do it. You might have the comedy club. It might just be that you have just a nice space for people to go to. It could be a whole bunch of different things.
Have you invited the police department in there with those discussions?
And, those discussions were primarily business planning discussions, so it was myself and Tara Sipes, our economic development manager, who were the leads on that discussion, or those discussions.
Makes sense to include the police department in on some of those, because they're gonna have to work with the businesses one way or the other, and we may come up with something that is far too restrictive. If they can come to an agreement of a better way to do this, then we might save a lot more time to move forward.
I have no objection to involving the police in those discussions.
I mean, assuming that the police department wants to be involved.
I don't. Chief, you should really just sit up here for this. But
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not even, sorry, this is going to sound harsh. It's not even a matter of whether the police want to be involved. It's a matter of, it's our decision, right? And again, if the consensus is, okay, we want to be cautious, we want to be safe, we want to do this right, whatever. If the consensus is we're philosophically okay with this idea as long as it's safe, regulated, the police have been involved, everybody knows what's going on, then that's one thing. If the conversation is we are just opposed to the idea of people consuming cannabis in a lounge, then that's another conversation. And I think that's what we need to clarify here is if we can work with the police department, work with the private sector, work with Miles, work with ourselves to get to a point where everyone's just kind of like, yeah, this is kind of new, but we all generally feel like this is well enough regulated, then we can move forward, unless that is not.
The only questions that I really have that come out of this have to do with liability, dram shop insurance, and city liability. Then how are we going to do enforcement? What does crime rate look like around these facilities? And, what kind of, the police going to do checks randomly in these like we do? And those were the only things. So it seems like I didn't have any opposition to the cafe/lounges themselves. It was just how are we going to manage it is what I got, with the exception of the mayor, who maybe, but the other alderman did not. I mean, that's what I got. Really, it was a liability issue and an enforcement issue. Is that correct? That's what I had written down here.
I don't know how you can make a decision on whether you like it or not until we know until we answer some of these questions. Again, let's hold off on this until we get the answers and then make a decision.
Another question is whether you do a separate room or just a separate area.
Sure.
Is another question. That the city has the rights.
Well,
so I guess what Mr. Tweet and myself need are just clear direction about what it is that you want staff to do. So
I
do you
guess
want
the-
us to investigate these questions?
Yeah, these things that you asked for specifically is what you want us to bring back more information on. But if they're answered to your satisfaction, I would assume everyone will be fine moving ahead then. Otherwise, why go to the work if we're not even
I believe-
planning to move ahead?
I believe we still should be able to try to get some influence or conversation with the police department,
Well, they would be involved in all of the discussions from here on out, so they would be involved.
you know.
That's part of this, you know, the enforcement and how are the police gonna work with the
And whether or not the
establishment.
license and charge a fee.
Yeah, and that would be, the licensing fee would be whatever our cost is, so they'd be similar to other licensing fees, which are generally $100 or so, maybe, I don't, so
They-
like
they
liquor,
vary quite a bit.
liquor is thousands of dollars.
Well, it could be higher than,
Well, but you're not making any money off of the, 80% of the revenue, the gross revenue has to be tobacco and tobacco-related products. So there really isn't any significant money to be made off of the marijuana itself. You would get our increased sales then of your products that you're already selling.
I see.
So it's, yeah, whether, exactly, whether it's $100 or whether it's almost $2,000 for a liquor license, total between the application and the license.
I mean, what we would do is, unless there was other direction, it would just, the same as our other licenses, we look at what kind of work does staff go into, and the licensing fee would cover that amount of work.
Just for clarification, wasn't there some mention of a club membership fee or something like on that order?
It would,
Well, that would be up to the business, but again, it could only, any revenue collected would be incidental to the tobacco and tobacco-related products. So the most it could be would be 20% of the total gross revenue.
and you can't charge sales tax on that because it's a service, not a product.
We need to
But it is a
update.
source of revenue
It
for.
it is a source,
the
but it
club
would,
owner.
it would be within that 20% of non-tobacco products.
And they could not sell, I mean, the issue is, it gets a sticky situation. If you're selling a product at above the market rate, including that as your membership, it could be subject to state laws and everything else, is once again, is that's where some would tell you, well, not to dilute their 80%, I'll sell, and at this point, I know, and I know Michelle's in the room, but I'll sell wrapping paper for $5 a piece, and that includes the membership, but it doesn't dilute that 80% because I sold a product. And so I think that's skirting, in my opinion, that's skirting the intent of the law. But
Again, it's,
that's a state to
That's the
regulate,
state.
not the city to regulate.
yeah, that's, and
I'm not-
and
you
I
know,
think
I'm not-
it's wise for us to, as much as we want to make sure that this is done safely and responsibly, I think that staff's recommendation of as little hands as possible is wise because we do not want to get sued, pretty much, right? We don't want to use as much city staff time when we could be doing things like our sustainability report. But also at the same time, we don't want to impose restrictions that a judge may find unconstitutional or something to that effect.
I was going to say, the number one goal is to not get sued.
Yeah, number one, you do not
Number
get
one
sued.
goal.
So,
Okay?
get more info?
Is there a time frame in which the council would like to get
But
this kind of
it
info?
depends how long it takes us to get the information together.
As soon
The
as
information
possible.
I got from the council is don't rush. Soon as possible, but don't rush it.
20, 40.
Take your time and gather the right information, so depends how long it takes us to gather the information.
Full amount of time.
Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for other topics.
I would
so,
expect next month we would come back with some information.
Okay.
but Unfortunately, we have some
No
other topics
chickens and
going.
bees?
Yeah, we're not going to get to talk about the birds and the bees, unfortunately.
Spend too
chickens.
much time talking
No.
about weed.
Yep.
If anybody has, since you actually all received those draft ordinances, if you want to review those and reach out with any questions, I would just really quickly say, the chicken ordinance that we have now, I just think it's a little too complicated. I have had to deny some applications for somewhat arbitrary reasons, and I think that's unfair to people. And then urban beekeeping, we have people who are doing it right now in the community. If you drive around carefully, you can see people's apiaries in their backyards. It's a perfectly fine thing to do. It isn't a nuisance, but if they're doing it, we should have some reasonable rules on it. So,
Quick comment about the chickens, or the bees, I suppose, on this one, too.
Yeah, in full disclosure, Mr. Parker is going through the licensing process at this time.
Full
for
disclosure,
chickens.
I'm trying to get my birds. But let's talk about how to request variances. I think that that's valid, that we have rules, but then under the certain appropriate circumstances, you could ask for variances similar to what we do with the BZA and things like that.
Sure, and so at this time, you are unable to ask for any variations from the ordinance as it is, so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great, good discussion.
Yeah.
Colleagues. Are they coming?
Set up an appointment with me.
Okay.
We should take the time to come over and talk. This is bullshit, obviously. They know.